Charles Taze Russell believed the Great Pyramid of Giza was God's witness in stone. Not metaphorically, not as some kind of spiritual symbol, literally. He took measurements of the internal passages of that pyramid in inches, and he used those measurements to calculate the date of Armageddon. And here's the thing, when the date came and went and nothing happened, he didn't say, "Well, I guess I was wrong." He adjusted the measurements. He went back, recalculated, and came up with a new date. The pyramid didn't change. The passages didn't get longer or shorter, but the numbers in the books did. That's how this started. That's the foundation of what 9 million people believe today. A man, a pyramid, and a date that didn't work out. And then another date, and another. Over the next 2 hours, you're going to watch a strange Bible study group become one of the most effective high-control organizations in modern history. You're going to see how it started, weird, earnest, and honestly kind of embarrassing when you look at it now. You're going to see the exact moment it turned, when one man seized power after the founder died and engineered an entire system of control from scratch. You're going to see the policies get locked in, blood transfusions banned, shunning formalized, the 1975 disaster and everything that came after. And you're going to see what it became, what it still is today. By the end of this, you won't just know the history. You'll understand exactly how the trap was built, layer by layer, leader by leader, decade by decade. You'll see the whole thing clearly, maybe for the first time. This is the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, from kooky to cult. But first, we need to go back to the very beginning, because before we can understand how this became a cult, we need to see how it started. And I promise you, it started stranger than most people have any idea, including most of Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. If you grew up in this organization, you were probably told it was God's one true channel of communication on earth, that it had always taught the truth, and any changes were just refinements as the light got brighter. If you're learning about Jehovah's Witnesses for the first time, that's what members are taught to believe. But here's what actually happened. This history isn't taught within the organization. Most Jehovah's Witnesses have never heard it. Why isn't this history taught to members? Why is it so hard to find in official sources? So let's start at the beginning, the real beginning, not the sanitized version. Charles Taze Russell was born in 1852 in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, right outside Pittsburgh. His family was Presbyterian, and by all accounts, young Charles took religion seriously, maybe too seriously. The kid was intense. He was reportedly so worried about hell as a child that he would go around town at night chalking Bible verses on fences and sidewalks to warn people about eternal damnation. But as he got older, something shifted. Russell started questioning some of the core doctrines he'd been taught, especially this idea of eternal hellfire. And honestly, I get it. The concept that a loving God would torture people consciously forever with no end, no relief, no purpose except punishment, that's a hard thing to square with the idea of divine love. Russell couldn't make it work in his head. So by his teenage years, he'd basically walked away from organized religion entirely. He described himself as a skeptic during this period. Not an atheist exactly, but someone who'd lost faith in the churches and the doctrines they were selling. But here's the thing, he didn't walk away from God. He didn't stop believing there was something out there, some truth to be found. He just decided the mainstream churches didn't have it, so he went looking somewhere else. And that's when, in his late teens, Russell wandered into an Adventist meeting. This is important context, so let me explain what this means. The Adventists were a movement that had grown out of what historians call the Great Disappointment of 1844. A Baptist preacher named William Miller had calculated, based on his reading of the book of Daniel, that Christ would return in 1844. Thousands of people believed him. They sold their possessions. They gathered on hillsides. They waited. And nothing happened. Some people walked away entirely after that, but others regrouped. They reinterpreted the prophecy. They said Miller had the date right, but the event wrong. Something did happen in 1844, just not on Earth. It happened in heaven, invisibly. If you're ever one of Jehovah's Witnesses, this probably sounds familiar. And get used to that pattern. It's going to come up again and again in this story. Russell was drawn to these Adventist ideas about Bible chronology and prophecy. He liked the systematic approach, the idea that you could map out God's timetable if you just studied carefully enough. He started attending meetings. He started his own Bible study group in the early 1870s, and this is where the story really begins. See, Russell wasn't trained as a theologian. He never went to seminary. He wasn't ordained by any church. He had no formal religious education whatsoever. What he was a businessman. He ran a chain of men's clothing stores with his father. The business did well. Russell had money. And he approached the Bible the way a businessman might approach a complicated contract or a puzzle to be solved, with confidence, with curiosity, with determination, and with absolutely no awareness of what he didn't know. He didn't know Greek or Hebrew. He wasn't familiar with the history of biblical interpretation. He just read the text in English, made calculations, and assumed he was right. That combination, absolute confidence without any actual credentials, is going to define everything that comes next. It's the founding DNA of this movement. By 1876, Russell had connected with a man named Nelson Barber, who published a magazine called Herald of the Morning out of Rochester, New York. Barber was part of that same Adventist tradition, and he had calculated something that caught Russell's attention. Christ had already returned. Not visibly, not in the flesh, not in a way anyone could see or measure, but spiritually, invisibly, in 1874. Christ was now present, just in heaven, not on earth. Now, if this sounds like a convenient way to claim your prophecy came true even though nothing observable happened, well, that's exactly what it is. But Russell loved this idea. It solved a problem. If you predict something and nothing visible happens, you've got two options. You can admit you were wrong, or you can claim it happened invisibly. Option 2 keeps the prophecy alive. Option 2 keeps you going. Russell was all in on option 2. He partnered up with Barber. Russell had the money. Barber had the prophetic framework. Russell funded the magazine. They wrote a book together called 3 Worlds and the Harvest of This World. And they set a new date, 1878. That was when the faithful would be taken to heaven. That was when everything would change. 1878 came, the year passed, nothing happened. The faithful were still on earth. No rapture, no resurrection, nothing. Barber started having doubts. He began questioning whether they'd gotten the chronology wrong, whether some of their fundamental calculations were off. Russell didn't want to hear it. He wasn't interested in questioning the system. He was interested in refining the system. They split, and it wasn't friendly. Russell went off and started his own magazine. He called it Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. The first issue came out in July 1879. It had a print run of about 6,000 copies. That magazine, The Watchtower, is still being published today, but the version they publish now would be almost unrecognizable to Russell. Here's what's important to understand about those early years. Russell wasn't running a centralized organization. There was no headquarters making decisions for everyone. There was no governing body in the modern sense. There were no elders with judicial authority. The Bible students, that's what they called themselves, not Jehovah's Witnesses, that name came later, were a loose network of independent study groups scattered across the country and eventually around the world. People subscribed to Russell's magazine. They read his books. They met in small groups in their homes or rented halls, and they largely governed themselves. Different groups had different practices. There was room for disagreement. People could ask questions. They could challenge interpretations. If you didn't like what one group was teaching, you could start your own or just stop attending. Nobody was going to track you down and hold a judicial committee. That's a private tribunal where 3 pastors, called elders, judge individuals for their sins in a private room with no recording devices or defense testimony allowed from any external witnesses. If you told Russell that his movement would one day be disfellowshipping people for celebrating Christmas or talking to former members, he would have had no idea what you were talking about. Disfellowshipping, now known as being removed, is the Jehovah's Witness form of excommunication. But that wasn't Russell's vision. That wasn't his organization. That came later from someone else entirely. This material doesn't appear in official Jehovah's Witness teaching. Most members have never heard of any of this in a kingdom hall, which is what they call their church. And if you're wondering how 9 million people could follow an organization with this history, the answer is simple. The history is not readily available, not because it's false, but because it's embarrassing. The organization didn't start with some divine revelation handed down from heaven. It started with a guy who thought he'd cracked the code of Bible prophecy, and then kept adjusting that code every time it didn't work. Let's look at how that played out. Okay, here's where it gets really strange. This is the part where current witnesses usually say, "That can't be right, you're making that up." I'm not making it up. This is documented. Anyone can read it in Russell's own published works. Russell didn't just believe in Bible chronology. He believed the Great Pyramid of Giza, the ancient Egyptian pyramid, the one tourists visit, the one with the Sphinx nearby, was a second witness to that chronology. He called it God's stone witness, and the Bible in stone. In his book, Studies in the Scriptures, Volume 3, the volume titled Thy Kingdom Come, Russell dedicated an entire chapter to pyramid measurements. Chapter 10. You can look it up. It's called The Testimony of God's Stone Witness and Prophet. Here's what Russell believed. He believed that God had inspired the construction of the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago, and that the measurements of its internal passages, when converted to years using a specific formula, confirmed his prophetic timeline. So he measured the descending passage. He measured the ascending passage. He measured the grand gallery, and he converted those measurements, in pyramid inches, which is a real unit he used, into years on his prophetic calendar. I want you to really sit with this for a second. The founder of what would become Jehovah's Witnesses, an organization that today claims to have the truth, believed that God had encoded the date of Armageddon inside an Egyptian pyramid, built by pagans, thousands of years ago, and you could decode it with a tape measure. This wasn't a fringe belief that Russell held privately and never talked about. It was published, it was taught, it was presented as evidence, it was central to his entire prophetic system. The pyramid proved that 1874 was the date of Christ's invisible return. It confirmed that the time of the end had begun in 1799. It demonstrated that 1914 would mark the end of the Gentile times and the full establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Russell was so confident in all of this that when he died, his followers built a pyramid-shaped monument at his gravesite. For decades, it stood in the Rosemont United Cemetery in Pittsburgh, right next to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's old headquarters cemetery plot. It had the Watchtower Society name right there on the stone. The monument was moved in 2021, but for nearly a century, visitors could see it for themselves, a literal pyramid marking the grave of the man who founded what would become Jehovah's Witnesses. Now here's the part that really matters. When 1914 came and went without Armageddon, the measurements had to change. Later editions of Studies in the Scriptures quietly adjusted the pyramid measurements to point to different dates. The 1897 edition gave one measurement for a key passage. The 1916 edition, published right around when Russell died, gave a different measurement for the exact same passage. Think about that. The pyramid didn't change. The passages didn't get longer or shorter. The stone was exactly the same as it had been for thousands of years, but the numbers in the book changed. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Rutherford, Russell's successor, eventually denounced pyramidology entirely. By the 1920s, the organization was teaching that the pyramid wasn't God's witness at all. It was actually Satan's. The very same monument that Russell had used as proof of divine truth became proof of demonic deception. Same pyramid, opposite meaning, and both positions were taught with absolute certainty. Many former members described feeling gaslit by the organization, explanations that didn't quite add up, new light that contradicted what they'd been taught before. This is where that pattern started. It was baked into the movement from the very beginning. This isn't trivia. This isn't some obscure historical footnote that doesn't matter. This is the foundation. The very first proof this movement offered for its prophetic authority was a pyramid measurement. And when the prophecy failed, they changed the measurement and kept going. That's not refinement. That's not light getting brighter. That's just making things up as you go. Let's talk about the dates, because there were a lot of them, and every single one failed. 1874 was supposed to be Christ's invisible return. Russell taught that for decades, and the organization didn't officially abandon 1874 as the date of Christ's presence until 1943, almost 30 years after Russell died, and nearly 70 years after the date itself. 1878 was supposed to be when the faithful would be resurrected and taken to heaven. Nothing happened. 1881 was supposed to be when the door to the heavenly calling closed, when the full number of the 144,000 was complete. That door has apparently stayed open ever since, given how many times the criteria have changed. For those who don't know, the 144,000 is the number that they believe would go to heaven. 1914 is the big one. This is the date that still gets taught today, so let's really look at what Russell actually predicted. Russell taught that 1914 would mark the end of the Gentile times, a period he calculated from the fall of Jerusalem in 607 BCE. According to Russell, October 1914 would be when God's kingdom was fully established. Not invisibly, not partially, fully. The earthly governments would be destroyed. Armageddon would come. Christ's rule would begin on earth. He was absolutely certain. In the January 1892 Watchtower, he wrote, "The date of the close of that battle is definitely marked in Scripture as October 1914. It is already in progress, its beginning dating from October 1874. So what happened when October 1914 arrived? Well, World War I had broken out a few months earlier, so Russell and his followers pointed to the war. They said, "See, we told you 1914 would be significant. Look at the turmoil. The Gentile times must be ending." But here's the problem. The war wasn't what Russell had predicted. He hadn't predicted a war between nations. He'd predicted the end of all human governments. He'd predicted Armageddon itself, not as a metaphor, but as the literal final battle. That didn't happen. And yet the movement survived. They reframed the failure as a partial success. They looked at world events and said, something significant happened in 1914, even if it wasn't exactly what we expected. Over time, the teaching evolved. Christ didn't establish his kingdom on earth in 1914. Instead, he was enthroned in heaven in 1914. He began ruling invisibly. The last days started in 1914, and we've been in them ever since. That's the version you were probably taught if you were ever one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But that's not what Russell taught. The current doctrine was constructed after the failure, not before it. It was a retrofit. For many Jehovah's Witnesses, the 1914 doctrine has never quite made sense. The explanations often feel strained, like they're working too hard. That's because the doctrine was rebuilt after the fact to salvage a failed prediction. The pieces don't fit together smoothly because they were never designed to fit together. They were assembled from the wreckage of Russell's original prophecy. Any confusion about this doctrine isn't spiritual weakness, it's clear thinking. Let me be clear about something. Every major prophetic date this organization has ever promoted has failed. 1874, 1878, 1881, 1914, 1918, 1925, 1975. Every single one. And every single time, the failure got reframed. New light, new understanding. The date was right, but we misunderstood what would happen. Or the members ran ahead of the organization. Or it happened invisibly, in heaven, where you can't check. This isn't a pattern of divine guidance being gradually clarified. This is a pattern of human predictions failing and then being rewritten. And it started right here in this era with Russell and his pyramid. Russell wasn't just a religious leader. He was a businessman, always had been. And sometimes those two roles got mixed up in ways that looked really bad. In 1908, Russell started promoting something called miracle wheat through the pages of the Watchtower magazine. This was a special strain of wheat, supposedly developed by a man named K.B. Stoner, that promised dramatically higher yields than regular wheat. Russell endorsed it enthusiastically. He sold it through the Watchtower Society at $60 a bushel. Now, let me give you some context. Regular wheat at the time was selling for about $1 a bushel. Russell was charging 60 times the going rate. That's a 6,000% markup. Russell claimed all the profits went to the Watchtower Society, not into his personal pocket. But still, $60 for wheat you could buy for $1 elsewhere, that raised some eyebrows. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a local newspaper, ran a series of articles questioning the claims about the wheat and the ethics of how it was being sold. They suggested Russell was profiting inappropriately from his followers' trust. Russell didn't respond by addressing the concerns. He sued the newspaper for libel. He took them to court. And he lost. The court found that the Eagle's reporting was accurate. The miracle wheat was tested by government agriculture experts from the Department of Agriculture, and it performed no better than ordinary wheat. In some tests, it actually performed worse. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying Russell was consciously running a scam. I think he probably believed in the wheat. He believed in a lot of things. He believed in the pyramid. He believed in his calculations. He had enormous confidence in his own judgment. But this incident reveals something important about the early Watchtower. From the very beginning, there was a pattern. Someone questions the organization, and instead of engaging with the criticism or examining whether it might be valid, the response is to attack the critic. The Eagle raised legitimate questions. Russell's response was a lawsuit. Silence the criticism, make the questioner the enemy. That instinct, attack critics rather than address criticism, is embedded in the organizational DNA. You're going to see it again and again throughout this history. The miracle wheat scandal isn't just an amusing historical anecdote. It's a preview of everything that came after. $60 for wheat that was worth $1. A lawsuit to silence a newspaper that asked questions. A leader who believed his own hype even when the evidence said otherwise. This is the soil the Watchtower was planted in, and you don't get healthy fruit from contaminated soil. There's one more piece of Russell's story that matters, not because it's salacious, but because it shows the same pattern we've seen everywhere else. Russell married Maria Frances Ackley in 1879, the same year he started the Watchtower magazine. She wasn't just his wife, she was an active partner in building the movement. Maria wrote articles, she edited publications, she contributed significantly to the early theology. By some accounts, she was the intellectual equal of Charles, maybe more. But by the early 1900s, the marriage was falling apart. The details are complicated and disputed, but Maria eventually accused Charles of inappropriate conduct with other women, particularly a younger woman named Rose Ball who lived in their household. Charles denied everything. Now, I'm not going to relitigate a divorce from over 100 years ago. The he said, she said details don't really matter at this point. What matters is what happened next. Maria asked for a legal separation. Charles fought it. The court eventually granted Maria's separation in 1906. The judge was not impressed with Russell. The court found that Russell had displayed egotism and domination that made life with him intolerable. The judge ordered Russell to pay alimony. Russell didn't want to pay, so he transferred his assets to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. The court found this was a deliberate attempt to shield his money from the alimony obligation. There were years of additional legal wrangling about the money. The point isn't to vilify Russell as a person. The point is this. Here was a man who presented himself as God's special servant, a spiritual leader uniquely chosen to reveal divine truth, and the court record shows someone who was, at minimum, willing to manipulate his finances to avoid his legal obligations to his wife. The public image and the private reality didn't quite match, and the organization he built would continue that tradition for the next 100+ years. To Jehovah's Witnesses, all of this was taught as truth. The pyramid measurements were truth. The prophetic dates were truth. Russell's character was above reproach, a faithful servant of God, humbly delivering divine messages. But the historical record tells a different story, and anyone is allowed to look at that record and evaluate it for themselves. That's not apostasy, that's just reading. Charles Taze Russell died on October 31, 1916. He was on a train traveling home from a speaking trip to the western United States. He was 64 years old. According to the accounts, he asked to be wrapped in a Roman toga in his final moments. One last eccentric act from an eccentric man. By that point, he'd built something real. The Watchtower magazine had tens of thousands of subscribers. The Bible students had groups meeting across the country and in several other countries, England, Germany, Australia, and beyond. Russell's books, especially the 6 volumes of Studies in the Scriptures, had been distributed in the millions. Some estimates put the total distribution at over 15 million copies. But here's the crucial thing. What Russell built was not what exists today. The movement he left behind was fundamentally different from the organization that now bears his legacy. The Bible students under Russell were decentralized. There was no hierarchy, no elders making decisions, no judicial committees, no disfellowshipping. Different study groups believed different things, and that was fine. People could disagree with Russell, could disagree in print, publicly, and still be welcome at Bible student meetings. There was no rule against birthdays, no rule against Christmas. In fact, the Bible students celebrated Christmas. No ban on blood transfusions, no prohibition on talking to former members. Russell was the center of gravity. His writings, his personality, his confidence held everything together, but the structure itself was loose. People could think for themselves. They could question. They could leave and come back. If Russell's movement had continued on that trajectory, it might have eventually faded into history like dozens of other 19th century American religious movements. A footnote in some scholar's book about the period. An interesting curiosity, nothing more. But that's not what happened. Because when Russell died, there was a power vacuum, and the man who stepped into that vacuum had a very different vision. Here's what's important to understand, because this changes everything. All of it, the control, the shunning, the rigid hierarchy, the fear of questioning, the judicial committees, the blood policy, the destroyed families, none of that existed under Russell. He was strange. He was wrong about pyramids and dates. His organization had problems, but he wasn't running a cult. The cult came later, which means that what hurts current and former members wasn't ancient. It wasn't original Christianity restored. It wasn't God's truth preserved through the centuries. It was added by men in the 20th century for reasons we're about to see. So let's be clear about what we've learned so far. Jehovah's Witnesses didn't grow up in the truth. They grew up in a system built on pyramid measurements that got changed when the dates failed. They were taught by an organization whose founder sued a newspaper for accurately reporting that his miracle wheat wasn't miraculous. The man who started all this believed an Egyptian monument could predict the future. He lost a lawsuit about the wheat. His own wife left him, and the court said he was egotistical and domineering. That's the foundation. That's what 9 million people are standing on today without knowing it. And here's what matters. No one who believed this was gullible or stupid or spiritually weak. They were children trusting adults, or they were seekers looking for answers. They did what humans do. They trusted people who claimed to have the truth. It's not a character flaw. That's just being human. But now we know things the organization has never made easy to find. Why is that? And that knowledge can't be unlearned. They can't unring this bell. So that's how it started. One man, some pyramid measurements, a lot of failed dates, and a scattered, loosely organized group of Bible students who genuinely thought they were on to something important. When Russell died, he left behind a movement that was weird and wrong about a lot of things, but wasn't oppressive. People could think, people could question, people could leave. But the man who stepped into that vacuum after Russell's death, he wasn't interested in keeping things loose and decentralized. He had a vision for something much more controlled, much more centralized, much more demanding of absolute loyalty. His name was Joseph Franklin Rutherford. He was a lawyer with a loud voice and a talent for power politics. And what he did to Russell's movement in the years after 1916, that's where this story takes a very different turn. That's where kooky becomes something else entirely. You've seen how this started. A man who believed pyramids could predict the future, failed dates, miracle wheat, a movement that was strange but not yet dangerous. Now we need to see how it turned, because everything that actually hurts members and former members, the shunning, the control, the absolute demand for obedience, it all traces back to one man in one decade. His name was Joseph Franklin Rutherford, and what he did to Russell's movement after 1916 wasn't evolution, it was a hostile takeover. If you're just joining us, here's what you need to know. Charles Taze Russell founded a loose network of Bible students in the late 1800s. They believed in pyramid prophecies, predicted multiple dates for the end of the world, and got every single one wrong. But they weren't a cult. There was no shunning, no rigid hierarchy, no demand for absolute obedience. Russell died in 1916, and the man who took over changed everything. For current and former witnesses, the fear of questioning often feels ancient, like it's always been part of their faith, but it wasn't. What you're about to see is how that fear was engineered by one man in the 1920s and 1930s. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was born in 1869 in Missouri. He grew up on a farm, studied law, and eventually became an attorney. He served briefly as a special judge in Missouri, which is where he got the nickname Judge Rutherford, even though he was never a full-time judge. It was a temporary appointment, but he used that title for the rest of his life. Rutherford was a big man, tall, broad, with a booming voice. People who knew him described him as intimidating, aggressive, and absolutely certain he was right about everything. He didn't have Russell's folksy charm. He had something else, a lawyer's instinct for power and a willingness to fight dirty to get it. He'd been involved with the Bible students since around 1906, and he quickly became Russell's legal counsel. When Russell died, Rutherford was positioned perfectly. He knew the organization's legal structure, he knew where the power was, and he knew how to take it. Here's what happened after Russell died. Russell's will had specified that editorial control of the Watchtower should go to a committee, a group of 5 people, not one person. He didn't want a single leader taking over. He'd seen what could happen with too much power concentrated in one place. The committee was supposed to include people who had been loyal to him, who understood his vision, who would preserve what he'd built. But Rutherford had other ideas. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was actually structured as a corporation, a legal entity separate from the religious movement itself. Russell had been president of that corporation, and the corporation's bylaws allowed for a presidential election. Within weeks of Russell's death, Rutherford was positioning himself. He moved fast, faster than anyone else who might have wanted the job. He controlled the narrative, framing himself as the natural successor, the loyal lieutenant who would carry on Russell's legacy. The vote happened in January 1917, just 2 months after Russell died. Rutherford won the presidency, but the way he won tells you everything about what kind of leader he would be. He didn't win by inspiring people. He didn't win by articulating a compelling vision. He won by understanding the legal structure better than anyone else and moving before opposition could organize. Classic power politics, pure and simple. But becoming president was just the first step. Russell's will had created a structure designed to prevent any one person from having total control. Rutherford had to dismantle that structure piece by piece. Russell's will had appointed 4 directors to the Watchtower Board who were supposed to serve for life. These men, A.I. Ritchie, Robert Hirsch, Isaac Hoskins, and James Wright, weren't Rutherford loyalists. They had their own views about how the organization should be run. They pushed back on some of Rutherford's early decisions. They asked questions. They wanted accountability. Rutherford didn't like questions. He didn't like pushback. He didn't like anyone who might challenge his authority. In the summer of 1917, Rutherford made his move. He announced that the 4 directors had never been legally appointed in the first place. He argued that there was a technical flaw in Russell's process for putting them on the board, that certain corporate formalities hadn't been followed. Using his legal expertise, he built a case that their positions were invalid. Then he had them removed. Just like that, and he replaced them with his own people, men who would support whatever he wanted to do. The ousted directors didn't go quietly. They protested publicly. They published pamphlets explaining what had happened. They tried to rally Bible students to their side, arguing that Rutherford was betraying Russell's vision. But it was too late. Rutherford controlled the printing presses. He controlled the Watchtower magazine. He controlled the headquarters building. He controlled the legal structure of the corporation. The directors could publish their pamphlets, but they couldn't match Rutherford's reach. Within a year of Russell's death, Rutherford had consolidated complete control. The safeguards Russell had built into his will, dismantled. The committee structure, gone. The directors who might have challenged him, removed and replaced. This wasn't a spiritual succession guided by divine providence. This was a corporate takeover executed by someone who understood how power works. Rutherford didn't inherit leadership because God chose him. He took it because he understood power, legal power, organizational power, the power of moving fast while others hesitated. The man who would shape everything about the Jehovah's Witness experience didn't get there through divine appointment. He got there through boardroom maneuvering. One of Rutherford's first major moves was publishing a book called The Finished Mystery in 1917. It was presented as the posthumous 7th volume of Russell's Studies in the Scriptures series, supposedly based on Russell's notes. But here's the thing, Russell hadn't written it. 2 men, Clayton Woodworth and George Fisher, had compiled it after his death, and Rutherford pushed it out quickly. Many Bible students felt it didn't represent Russell's views accurately. Some of the interpretations were bizarre, even by the standards of the time. The book caused immediate controversy. Some Bible students rejected it outright. They said it wasn't authentic Russell teaching. But Rutherford made acceptance of the book a loyalty test. If you rejected The Finished Mystery, you were rejecting the organization. This was new. Under Russell, people could disagree about interpretations. They could have different views and still be part of the movement. Rutherford was introducing something different, ideological conformity. You either accepted what the organization published or you were out. The Finished Mystery also got the organization into legal trouble. It contained statements critical of the war effort and mainstream clergy. In 1918, Rutherford and several other Watchtower leaders were arrested and convicted under the Espionage Act. They spent almost a year in federal prison before their convictions were overturned on appeal. Rutherford came out of prison more aggressive than ever. He framed the experience as persecution, proof that the organization was doing something right if the world was against them. That persecution narrative became central to the movement's identity. Us against the world, the faithful few against the corrupt many. If you've ever noticed that this organization seems to thrive on conflict, that there's always an enemy, always a threat, always someone attacking the faithful, this is where that started. Rutherford built persecution into the organizational DNA, not just as something that happened to them, but as something that proved they were right. Throughout the 1920s, Rutherford systematically pushed out anyone who disagreed with him. Remember, the Bible students under Russell had been decentralized. Local groups had real autonomy. People could hold different views. That diversity was a feature, not a bug. Rutherford saw it as a problem to be solved. He demanded loyalty, not to ideas, not to scripture, but to the organization, to him. If you questioned his leadership or his interpretations, you weren't just wrong, you were disloyal, and disloyalty had consequences. Thousands of Bible students left during this period. By some accounts, the majority of Russell's original followers eventually split from Rutherford's organization. They formed their own groups, some of which still exist today, still calling themselves Bible students, still following Russell's original teachings. The people who stayed with Rutherford were the ones willing to accept centralized control. They were the ones who would follow orders, and that self-selection process shaped the culture of the organization for the next 100 years. This is important. The organization that exists today wasn't the natural continuation of Russell's movement. It was what was left after Rutherford drove out everyone who wouldn't submit. Did the culture of obedience evolve naturally, or was it selected for deliberately? Now, here's where Rutherford's own version of kooky shows up, because while he was consolidating power and demanding loyalty, he was also doing some pretty strange things himself. In 1929, Rutherford had a mansion built in San Diego, California. Not a modest house, a mansion, 10 bedrooms, beautiful Spanish colonial architecture, gorgeous views, prime real estate in one of the nicest parts of the city. He called it Beth Sarim, which means House of the Princes in Hebrew. Why that name? Because Rutherford taught that the ancient worthies, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and other faithful men from the Old Testament, were going to be resurrected any day now. They'd come back to life in the flesh right here on earth. And when they did, they'd need somewhere to live, somewhere befitting their status as princes of God's kingdom. So Rutherford built them a house. I want you to really sit with that for a second. The president of the Watchtower Society, in the middle of the Great Depression, while his followers were struggling to put food on their tables, this man built a mansion in San Diego for resurrected biblical prophets who might show up any day. It gets better. The deed to the property was actually made out to King David, legally, on paper. The official documents listed David as the owner. The house was held in trust for David and the other ancient worthies until they arrived to claim it. They never showed up. Abraham didn't knock on the door. Isaac didn't move into one of the 10 bedrooms. David never claimed his property. In the meantime, guess who lived there? Rutherford. He spent his winters at Beth Sarim, enjoying the San Diego sunshine, the mild weather, the ocean breezes. While his followers sacrificed and struggled through the Depression, while they gave their money to the organization, while they went door to door in the heat and the cold, Rutherford was living in a mansion he justified with a prophecy about dead men coming back to life. When Rutherford died in 1942, at Beth Sarim, by the way, the ancient worthies still hadn't shown up. The organization quietly sold the property a few years later. Today, they don't talk about Beth Sarim much. It's an embarrassment they'd rather forget. But it happened. It's documented. You can look up the property records. This isn't making a big deal of nothing. A leader who demanded sacrifice from his followers while building himself a mansion and justifying it with a prophecy that never came true, that's worth noticing. The pattern of leadership privilege alongside member sacrifice didn't start recently. It was there from Rutherford's time. Before we move on, we need to talk about 1925. Because while everyone knows about 1914 and 1975, not as many people talk about 1925. It might have been the worst prophetic failure of them all. Rutherford was obsessed with dates, just like Russell. He needed dates. Dates created urgency. Dates motivated people. Dates kept members focused on the future instead of asking too many questions about the present. And in the early 1920s, Rutherford became convinced that 1925 would be the year everything changed. In 1920, he published a booklet called Millions Now Living Will Never Die. The title wasn't metaphor or hyperbole, it was a literal prediction. Rutherford taught that 1925 would mark the beginning of the earthly resurrection. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, all the faithful men and women of the Old Testament would rise from the dead. The millennium would begin. Paradise would start on earth. People alive in 1920, Rutherford promised, would live right through into that paradise without ever dying. Millions now living will never die. He meant it literally. And he was absolutely certain. At a convention in 1922, Rutherford stood up and declared, "The date 1925 is even more distinctly indicated by the scriptures than 1914. Think about that for a second. More distinctly indicated than 1914. He was more confident about 1925 than Russell had ever been about 1914. He was betting everything on this date. The organization went all in. They printed millions of copies of Millions Now Living Will Never Die. They distributed in dozens of languages. They held conventions. They made speeches. The message was everywhere. The end is coming. 1925. Get ready. And the members believed it. Why wouldn't they? This was their leader speaking for God's organization, telling them with absolute certainty what was about to happen. People made life decisions based on this prediction. They sold their businesses. They quit their jobs. They didn't pursue education. Why would you need a degree in paradise? They didn't save for retirement. There wasn't going to be a retirement. Some sold their homes. They gave up their futures because the organization told them the future wasn't coming. And then 1925 arrived. January passed. February, March, spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. And nothing happened. No resurrection. No ancient worthies walking the earth. No paradise. No millennium. Just another year. Just another failed prediction. The fallout was devastating. Thousands of members left. The organization's membership dropped significantly. People who had sacrificed everything, their savings, their careers, their plans, realized they'd been deceived. The credibility of the organization was in ruins. And what did Rutherford do? What did the leadership do? Years later, Rutherford admitted he'd made an ass of himself. That's the word he used. But he never truly took responsibility. He never apologized to the people who'd sold their homes. He never made restitution to the members who'd abandoned their futures. Instead, he blamed them. He said they had been too eager. They had run ahead of the organization. They had expected too much. Sound familiar? That exact script played out again 50 years later with 1975. Leaders make a prediction. Members believe it. Members sacrifice for it. The prediction fails, and somehow, mysteriously, it's the members' fault for believing what they were told. The playbook was written in 1925. They've been using it ever since. Every failed prophecy has the same aftermath. The leaders never truly own it. The members who believed, who sacrificed, who gave up their futures, they're the ones who get blamed. Anyone who ever felt foolish for believing what they were taught should remember, they were doing exactly what the organization told them to do. The failure belongs to the leadership, not the members. In 1931, Rutherford made one of his most consequential moves. At a convention in Columbus, Ohio, he announced that the organization would adopt a new name, Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, on the surface, this might seem like just a branding decision, a name change, marketing, but it was much more than that. It was a strategic masterstroke that served multiple purposes at once. First, the name Bible students connected the movement to Russell. It carried the history, the associations, the identity that Russell had built over 40 years. Changing the name was a way of cutting that cord. Rutherford was declaring, in effect, we're not Russell's movement anymore. We're something new, something different, something that belongs to me. Second, the timing mattered. This was 1931, 6 years after the 1925 disaster. The organization was still recovering. Thousands had left. The Bible students' name was associated with failed prophecies and broken promises. A new name meant a fresh start, a chance to leave the embarrassments behind. Third, and this is the most important part, the new name created a sharper boundary between members and everyone else. Think about what it means to call yourself a Bible student. It's descriptive. It says what you do. Lots of people study the Bible. Catholics study the Bible. Baptists study the Bible. You can be a Bible student and still have things in common with other Christians. But Jehovah's Witnesses? That's different. That's not just describing an activity. That's declaring an identity, a specific, exclusive identity. You're not just someone who studies the Bible. You're a witness. You belong to a particular group. You're set apart. And if you're set apart, if your very name declares that you're different from everyone else, then it becomes much harder to leave. Because leaving doesn't just mean changing your beliefs, it means losing your identity. What are you if you're not a witness? Rutherford understood something important about human psychology. Identity is powerful. Once someone sees themselves as a Jehovah's Witness, once that label becomes central to who they are, they'll defend it. They'll sacrifice for it. They'll resist any information that threatens it. The name change wasn't just branding. It was a psychological lock, and it's been working ever since. Many former witnesses describe feeling like they didn't quite belong anywhere, too worldly for the organization, but too marked by their upbringing to fit seamlessly into mainstream society. This is where the trap was built. This is how high control groups engineer identity to make leaving feel impossible. The sharp us versus them boundary wasn't just theology, it was a control mechanism. It made leaving feel like exile. Under Russell, the Bible students celebrated Christmas. They celebrated birthdays. These weren't controversial. Russell himself had Christmas celebrations at the Brooklyn headquarters. Rutherford ended all of that. By the late 1920s, he had declared that Christmas was a pagan holiday that true Christians shouldn't celebrate. The same logic eventually extended to birthdays, Easter, and basically any celebration that connected witnesses to mainstream society. Now, you can make theological arguments about the pagan origins of various holidays. People have been debating those for centuries. But here's what's interesting about Rutherford's timing. He banned Christmas right after the 1925 failure, right when the organization was hemorrhaging members, right when people were questioning his leadership. By banning holidays, Rutherford accomplished several things at once. He gave his remaining followers something to do, a visible way to demonstrate their loyalty. He created another boundary between witnesses and the world, and he cut members off from one more connection to outsiders. When you can't celebrate Christmas with your non-witness family, that's one less reason to spend time with them, one less bridge to the outside world, one more tie cut. The birthday ban came a bit later. It wasn't fully enforced until the early 1950s under a different administration, but the logic was the same. Every celebration banned was a connection severed. The holiday bans weren't really about theology. They were about isolation. Every tradition members couldn't participate in was a wall between them and everyone who wasn't a witness. Every birthday they couldn't celebrate was a reminder that they were different, separate, apart. That isolation made leaving harder, and that was the point. This is heavy material. For anyone learning about high control systems, whether from personal experience or for the first time, it can be difficult to absorb. When you look at how the system functions, the isolation, the control, the barriers to leaving, can that be accidental? Or does it look engineered? Millions of people, families across generations. Take a breath if you need to. We're about halfway through this story, and the next section gets into the real machinery of control. Okay, let's keep going. Throughout the 1930s, Rutherford continued centralizing power, but he didn't just want organizational control, he wanted theological justification for it. So he developed what he called theocratic government. The idea was simple. Jehovah runs the organization from heaven through Jesus, through the leadership on earth. The leaders don't take orders from the members, they take orders from God, and members take orders from the leaders. Democracy was explicitly rejected. Voting was eliminated in congregations. Elders were no longer elected by their local congregations, they were appointed from above. The organization wasn't accountable to its members, it was only accountable to God. Inconveniently, the leadership got to interpret what God wanted. This was a fundamental shift. Under Russell, there had been at least some sense of bottom-up organization. Local groups had autonomy. Members had voices. Rutherford eliminated all of that. The flow of authority was strictly top-down. Headquarters decided, members obeyed. If you've ever wondered why witnesses treat questioning like sin, why even private doubts feel like betrayal of God Himself, this is where that theology came from. Rutherford built a system where disobedience to the organization was disobedience to God, where loyalty to human leaders was framed as loyalty to Jehovah. That's not just organizational structure, that's a trap for the conscience. Rutherford also transformed the organization into a literature distribution machine. Under Russell, the Bible students had studied Russell's writings, his books, his magazine articles, but there was room for discussion, interpretation, independent thought. Rutherford standardized everything. He produced a constant stream of books, booklets, and magazines, and he expected witnesses to distribute them, door to door, every week, rain or shine. The door-to-door preaching work became mandatory. It wasn't just something committed witnesses did. It was the primary marker of faithfulness. Spirituality was measured by hours. Dedication was measured by placements. This served multiple purposes. It kept members busy, too busy to think, too busy to question. It reinforced the us versus them mentality. Every door slammed in a witness's face was proof the world was hostile, and it made members feel invested. The more someone sacrifices for something, the harder it is to admit it might not be true. Rutherford understood something important about human psychology. If you can get people to work hard for a belief, they'll convince themselves it must be valuable. Nobody wants to think their sacrifice was meaningless. The hours spent, the doors knocked on, the rejection faced. This wasn't just preaching. It was a psychological investment that made leaving harder. The more members gave, the more they had to lose by admitting it wasn't true. Was this just an accident, or was it designed? Now, here's something important. Formal disfellowshipping, the judicial committee process, the mandatory shunning, that didn't exist yet. That came later in 1952 under the next administration. But Rutherford laid the groundwork. Throughout his tenure, he made loyalty to the organization the ultimate test of faithfulness. If you disagreed with headquarters, you weren't just wrong, you were rebellious. You were like Satan, who had rebelled against God. You were an enemy. People who challenged Rutherford weren't just debated. They weren't denounced. They were labeled. They were driven out. The thousands of Bible students who left during Rutherford's purges, they weren't formally disfellowshipped the way it would happen later, but they were treated as enemies, as apostates, as people to be shunned and avoided. The formal policy came later, but the spirit of it, the idea that leaving or disagreeing makes you an enemy to be cut off, that was Rutherford's creation. Here's what I want you to see. This is the moment the organization stopped being a belief system and became an obedience system. Under Russell, you could believe weird things. You could study pyramids and predict wrong dates and still be part of the community. What mattered was your interest in Bible study, your engagement with the ideas. Under Rutherford, what mattered was loyalty, obedience, conformity. Did you accept what headquarters taught? Did you follow orders? Did you submit? The content of belief became less important than the act of submission, and that shift from belief system to obedience system, that's the moment this became something different, something dangerous. That's the line between kooky and cult. Joseph Franklin Rutherford died on January 8, 1942, at Beth Serene, the mansion he'd built for prophets who never came. He was 72 years old. He'd been running the organization for 25 years, and in that time he had completely transformed it. He'd taken Russell's loose, decentralized, somewhat democratic movement and turned it into a centralized, authoritarian, high-control organization. He'd purged the dissenters. He'd demanded obedience. He'd built a persecution narrative. He'd isolated members from the outside world. He'd created a theology that made disobedience to human leaders equivalent to disobedience to God. Everything that makes this organization what it is today, the control, the isolation, the mandatory conformity, it all traces back to Rutherford. Russell gave them the kooky foundation. Rutherford built the cage. Jehovah's Witnesses weren't controlled by ancient Christianity. They weren't controlled by the Bible. They were controlled by a system one man built in the 1920s and 30s. Joseph Rutherford, a lawyer who maneuvered his way into power, who built himself a mansion while his followers struggled, who blamed members for believing the predictions he made. That's who designed the walls that millions of people have lived inside. Anyone who questions isn't rebellious. Anyone who doubts isn't disloyal. They're just refusing to stay in a cage built by a man who's been dead for over 80 years. And that refusal, that's not weakness, that's clarity. So that's how it turned. That's how Russell's strange little Bible study group became something else entirely. Rutherford didn't just lead the organization, he remade it in his image. Centralized, authoritarian, demanding absolute loyalty. But here's the thing. When Rutherford died, the machinery was in place, but it wasn't fully locked in yet. The most damaging policies were still coming. The blood doctrine, the formal shunning, the 1975 disaster. That's the next chapter. The men who came after Rutherford, Nathan Knorr and Frederick Franz, they took his authoritarian structure and filled it with policies that would destroy families and cost lives. Rutherford built the cage, they locked the door. You've seen the kooky origins. You've seen the hostile takeover. Now we need to see how it locked in. Because the policies that actually broke families, the ones that cost lives, that destroyed relationships, that made leaving feel impossible, those policies have dates, and those dates may be younger than you think. The blood doctrine, the formal shunning, the 1975 catastrophe. This is where history stops being abstract and starts getting personal. If you're just joining us, here's what you need to know. This organization started as a strange, loosely organized Bible study group under Charles Russell. Pyramid prophecies, failed dates, but no real control mechanisms. Then Joseph Rutherford took over, purged the dissenters, and built an authoritarian structure demanding absolute loyalty. But Rutherford's machine was still missing something. It had the structure. It had the ideology. What it didn't have yet were the specific policies that would make the trap inescapable. That's what came next. If you or someone you know ever lost a loved one to the blood policy, or almost lost themselves, this section might be hard to hear. If shunning tore a family apart, some of this will hit close to home. Take your time. We're going to walk through this carefully. And by the end, you'll understand exactly when these policies were invented and by whom. When Rutherford died in 1942, a man named Nathan Knorr took over. Knorr was different from Rutherford in almost every way. Where Rutherford was loud and bombastic, Knorr was quiet and administrative. Where Rutherford craved the spotlight, Knorr preferred to work behind the scenes. He stopped putting individual authors' names on Watchtower publications. Everything became anonymous, credited only to the organization. The cult of personality that Rutherford had built around himself was replaced by a cult of the institution. Knorr was an organization man, a manager. He thought in terms of systems, processes, and efficiency, and he set about professionalizing what Rutherford had built. He established the Gilead School to train missionaries. He standardized the Theocratic Ministry School in every congregation, the weekly training program where witnesses practiced public speaking and door-to-door presentations. He expanded the printing operations dramatically. He turned the Watchtower into a global publishing machine. But Knorr wasn't really a theologian. For the doctrinal work, he relied heavily on another man, Frederick Franz. And Franz would become one of the most influential figures in the organization's history. Frederick Franz was the intellectual engine of the Watchtower during this era. He was the one who developed the theological arguments, who wrote the doctrinal articles, who provided the biblical justifications for whatever the organization wanted to do. If Knorr was the CEO, Franz was the chief ideologist. Together, these two men would implement the policies that transformed Rutherford's authoritarian structure into something even more controlling. Something that could reach into the most intimate areas of members' lives. Something that could dictate medical decisions, family relationships, and the boundaries of conscience itself. Let's start with the policy that has cost the most lives, the prohibition on blood transfusions. Today, witnesses are taught that refusing blood is an ancient biblical command, one of the most fundamental principles of their faith. Parents teach it to their children from infancy. Witnesses carry cards in their wallets declaring the refusal of blood. They're prepared to die rather than accept a transfusion. But here's the truth. This doctrine didn't exist until 1945. For the first 65 years of the organization's existence, there was no prohibition on blood transfusions. Russell never taught it. Rutherford never enforced it. Blood transfusions became a common medical procedure in the early 20th century, and witnesses could receive them without any spiritual consequences. Then, in 1945, the Watchtower published an article declaring that blood transfusions were a violation of God's law. The reasoning was based on a few passages in Genesis and Acts that prohibit eating blood, commands originally about consuming animal blood as food. Ancient Israelites weren't supposed to eat blood because blood represented life, and life belonged to God. The organization took those ancient dietary laws and extended them to a modern medical procedure that didn't exist when those texts were written. They declared that receiving a transfusion was equivalent to eating blood. Putting blood into your veins was the same as putting it into your stomach. Therefore, transfusions were forbidden. There were problems with this reasoning from the start. Medical professionals pointed out that a transfusion doesn't digest blood. It transfers it into the circulatory system, where it functions as blood, not as food. The body doesn't metabolize transfused blood the way it metabolizes food. It's a completely different biological process. But the organization wasn't interested in those distinctions. They had made their ruling, and over the following years, they made it increasingly strict and increasingly complicated. Blood itself was forbidden. But what about blood fractions, the component parts of blood? What about procedures that use your own blood? The organization developed an elaborate system of rules about what was acceptable and what wasn't. Some fractions were permitted as a conscience matter, others were absolutely forbidden. The distinctions often seemed arbitrary, based more on organizational decree than biblical principle. And the penalty for violating this policy was severe. Accept a blood transfusion, and a witness could be disfellowshipped, shunned by everyone they knew, cut off from their community, their family, their entire social world. Think about that timeline. The organization existed for over 6 decades before this became a rule. Witnesses in 1940 could receive transfusions. Witnesses in 1946 could be expelled for it. The doctrine wasn't discovered in Scripture after careful study. It was invented in 1945 and imposed on millions of people. The first witnesses who died refusing blood transfusions had no idea they were following a brand new rule. They thought they were upholding an ancient biblical command. They thought this is what faithful Christians had always believed. It wasn't. The policy was 3 years old when the first people started dying for it. We don't know exactly how many people have died because of this policy. The organization doesn't track it, or if they do, they don't publish the numbers. There's no memorial, no acknowledgement, no accounting of the cost. But we know that it's not a small number. There are documented cases of children who died when their parents refused transfusions on their behalf. Tiny children who had no say in the matter, whose lives ended because adults believed a magazine article from 1945 represented God's eternal will. There are adults who bled out on operating tables, accident victims who could have been saved with routine transfusions, cancer patients who couldn't receive certain treatments, mothers who died in childbirth when a transfusion could have saved them. Some of these people desperately wanted to live. They weren't martyrs seeking death. They were people who had been taught from childhood that accepting blood was worse than dying, that a few more years on earth wasn't worth an eternity of destruction from Jehovah. So they refused, and they died. For decades, the organization didn't just accept these deaths. They celebrated them. They held them up as examples of outstanding faith. The May 22, 1994 issue of Awake magazine featured a cover story about children who had died refusing blood. The cover showed photos of actual kids, real children who had really died, with the headline, "Youths Who Put God First." Inside, the article presented their deaths as something admirable, something other witness children should aspire to. Let me say that plainly. The organization published an article praising children for dying. They put dead kids on the cover and called them heroes. These were children, kids who trusted their parents, who trusted the elders, who trusted the organization. They had been taught from birth that accepting blood was a sin worse than death. They didn't have the life experience or cognitive development to evaluate that claim critically. They couldn't consent in any meaningful sense. They died because adults told them to. And then those adults published their photos in a magazine and called it faithfulness. The organization has since softened its rhetoric about blood. They've changed how they present this history over time, but they've never apologized. They've never acknowledged the lives lost. They've never admitted that the policy was invented in 1945 by men who had no special insight into God's will. The dead are just gone, forgotten, erased. This material is difficult, and it's worth pausing briefly before continuing. We're talking about a policy that has killed people, including children. A policy that was invented in 1945 and presented as ancient truth. A policy that millions of families have followed without ever knowing its real history. Take a moment if you need to. We're gonna keep going, but there's no shame in finding this heavy. No one is being dramatic for finding this disturbing. A policy that costs lives deserves scrutiny, and anyone is allowed to scrutinize it, even those who were taught that questioning was the same as disobedience to God. Now let's talk about the policy that made leaving feel impossible: disfellowshipping. Remember, under Russell, there was no formal shunning. People could disagree with Russell. They could leave a Bible student group and join another one or start their own. The community was loose enough that departure wasn't catastrophic. Rutherford changed the atmosphere. He created an environment where dissenters were pushed out, labeled as enemies, treated as apostates. But there still wasn't a codified judicial process with formal rules and procedures. That process began taking shape in 1952. In that year, the Watchtower published a series of articles establishing the formal disfellowshipping framework. The machinery would get more procedural and standardized in the decades that followed, but the core system was now being put in place. Judicial committees were formed, small groups of elders who would meet privately with accused members, evaluate their attitude, determine whether they were sufficiently repentant, and decide their fate. If a member was found guilty of a serious sin, and the list of serious sins keeps expanding over the years, and if the elders determined they weren't repentant enough, they were disfellowshipped. Their name was announced to the congregation, and from that moment on, every witness in the world, including their own family, was required to shun them. The rules were strict. No casual conversation, no family dinners, no phone calls, no text messages, no acknowledging the person in public. If a family member saw them on the street, they were supposed to look away, pretend they didn't exist. In many cases, parents stopped speaking to their children. Adult children cut off their elderly parents. Brothers and sisters who had been close their entire lives became strangers overnight. Marriages ended. Multi-generational families splintered into factions of those who stayed and those who were expelled. The organization presented this as a loving arrangement. They quoted scriptures about not associating with sinners. They said the purpose was to keep the congregation clean. They said the pain of isolation would motivate disfellowship people to repent and return to Jehovah. But here's what it actually accomplished. It made leaving nearly impossible. Think about it from the perspective of a doubting witness. They've spent their whole life in this organization. Everyone they know is a witness. Parents, siblings, spouse, children, friends, their entire social world. When doubts arise, the choice becomes stark. Remain and suppress those doubts, or leave and lose their entire social world. Every relationship, every connection, everything that matters to them. That's not a free choice. That's coercion. The threat of total social destruction keeps people trapped even when they no longer believe a word of what's being taught. Shunning isn't discipline, it's hostage-taking. Relationships are held hostage to compliance. Stay and comply and members get to keep their family. Leave or disagree and they lose everything. That's not love, that's control. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the organization kept expanding its reach into members' lives. They developed detailed rules about dating, courtship, and marriage. They regulated what kind of employment was acceptable. They dictated entertainment choices, the kinds of movies, music, and books that were appropriate. They controlled hairstyles, dress codes, beard policies. Nothing was too small to regulate. Nothing was outside the organization's jurisdiction. And the judicial committee system meant there was always enforcement. If a member stepped out of line, someone might report them. Elders might call them in for a meeting. They might find themselves facing a committee, trying to prove their repentance, trying to avoid being cut off from everyone they love. The fear was constant. The surveillance was everywhere. In the congregation, in the family, even in members' own minds, because they'd been taught that Jehovah could see their thoughts, and the organization spoke for Jehovah. Many former witnesses describe a constant feeling of being watched, like they couldn't trust anyone, like any mistake might be reported. That wasn't paranoia. Was the system designed to create that feeling? Was the surveillance a feature or a bug? Now we come to one of the most devastating episodes in the organization's history, 1975. We talked about 1925 earlier, Rutherford's failed prediction that cost the organization thousands of members. You'd think they would have learned. You'd think the leadership would have been more careful about setting dates, more cautious about creating expectations they couldn't fulfill. They weren't. In the mid-1960s, Frederick Franz began teaching that 1975 would mark 6,000 years since the creation of Adam. According to the organization's theological framework, this was hugely significant. The 1,000-year reign of Christ was supposed to correspond to the seventh day of creation, a cosmic Sabbath. Human history was divided into 7 1,000-year periods, mirroring the 7 days of creation. If 1975 was the end of 6,000 years, then the final 1,000-year period, the millennium, should begin right around then. Now, Franz was smart enough not to come right out and say Armageddon will come in 1975. He'd seen what happened to the organization's credibility after 1925. He was more careful than Rutherford had been, more skilled at creating deniability. But he said enough. He implied enough. He created an expectation that was absolutely unmistakable. At the 1966 International Convention, Franz gave a talk that electrified the audience.
But the big question is this. Is this year 1975 the final year, the last year before the Great Tribulation breaks and reaches its climax in the battle of the great day of God the Almighty at Armageddon? So you see, we haven't got much left to this year 1975. It's going to end at sundown of September the 5th. And that immediately after September the 5th, why, the millennial kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ must begin in order to fulfill the final 1,000 years of God's great seventh creative day. And they're expecting the great tribulation to occur and the destruction of Babylon the Great and the annihilation of all the political systems of this world, and then the binding of Satan and his demons and their abyssing to occur before this year is ended.
The organization's publications reinforce this message at every turn. A 1966 book called Life Everlasting and Freedom of the Sons of God included a chart showing that 1975 marked the end of 6,000 years of human history. The book didn't say Armageddon would come in 1975. Instead, it asked a leading question: how appropriate it would be for Jehovah God to make of this coming seventh period of 1,000 years a Sabbath period of rest and release. How appropriate it would be. See how that works? It's not a prediction. It's a suggestion, an implication, a wink and a nod that everyone understood perfectly. Later Watchtower articles continued building this expectation. A 1968 article said the time left was very short and urged witnesses to work with urgency. A 1969 article discouraged young witnesses from pursuing higher education because the world's end is so near. Why would you need a college degree when paradise was just a few years away? The organization knew exactly what it was doing. They were creating an expectation they could benefit from while maintaining enough ambiguity to claim they've never made a firm prediction. This is how prophetic manipulation works. You don't say it directly, you imply it. You create an expectation, and then when it fails, you say, "We never actually said that." Except they did say it. Not in those exact words, but clearly enough that everyone understood. The response was massive. Witnesses around the world reorganized their lives around 1975. They sold their homes, they cashed out their retirement savings, they quit their jobs, they postponed surgeries. They didn't bother with education. Why would you need a degree when paradise was coming in a few years? Some pioneers, full-time preachers, calculated exactly how many months of service they could fit in before the end. Kingdom Ministry, the internal newsletter for the congregation activities, acknowledged and encouraged this urgency. The organization didn't just fail to correct the expectation, they amplified it. They rode the wave of excitement. Membership surged as people rushed to get baptized before it was too late. And the leadership knew what was happening. They saw the sacrifices people were making. They could have stepped in and said, "Wait, we're not making a specific prediction. Don't sell your house." But they didn't. They let it happen, and they benefited from it. And then 1975 came and went. The autumn passed. October, November, December, no Armageddon, no paradise, no resurrection, no sign of anything at all. Just another year ending, just another prediction failing, just like 1914, just like 1925. But this time, the fallout was enormous. Unlike the earlier failures, this one happened in the modern era. There were more witnesses than ever before. More people had made sacrifices, more people had reorganized their lives around the expected end, and more people noticed when nothing happened. Tens of thousands of members left. The organization lost a significant portion of its membership in the years immediately following 1975. For an organization that had been experiencing explosive growth, membership had nearly doubled between 1966 and 1975, this was a crisis. The growth rate didn't just slow, it reversed. In the aftermath, you might think the leadership would have been humble. You might think they would have acknowledged their role in creating expectations. You might think they would have apologized to the families who had made sacrifices based on what they were told. They didn't. They did what the organization has always done when prophecies fail. They blamed the members. In 1976 and 1977, Watchtower articles began subtly shifting responsibility. The problem, these articles suggested, wasn't that the organization had pointed to 1975. The problem was that some witnesses had been overly eager. They had read too much into what was published. They had run ahead of the organization. Never mind that the organization had published charts pointing to 1975. Never mind that Frederick Franz had given speeches building the expectation. Never mind that Kingdom Ministry had encouraged the urgency. Never mind that Watchtower articles had discouraged education because the time was so short. All of that was memory hold. The official narrative became, the organization never made a firm prediction, and the members who expected too much had only themselves to blame. It took years before any real acknowledgement emerged. In 1980, the governing body member Frederick Franz, the same man who had promoted 1975 in the first place, gave a talk at Bethel that acknowledged the organization bore some responsibility for the expectations. But even this was hedged, qualified, partial. It wasn't an apology, it was damage control. And for the members who had sacrificed, there was nothing. No compensation, no acknowledgement of what they'd lost. The people who had sold their homes didn't get their homes back. The people who had cashed out their retirement funds didn't get those savings back. The people who had skipped college didn't get those years back. The people who had postponed medical treatments didn't get their health back. They were just supposed to move on, shake it off, keep going to meetings, keep going door to door, keep trusting the same organization that had just misled them. And many did, because what was the alternative? They had already given everything. They had already alienated family members who weren't witnesses. They had already built their entire lives around this organization. Walking away would mean admitting it had all been for nothing. So they stayed, and they taught their children, and the cycle continued. If anyone was affected by 1975, if their parents or grandparents made sacrifices based on that expectation, they're not crazy for being angry about it. The leadership created the expectation. The members paid the price. And then the members got blamed. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern. The 1975 disaster had consequences inside headquarters too, because one of the men at the very top, a governing body member named Raymond Franz, began having serious doubts. Raymond Franz's position in the organization was extraordinary. He was Frederick Franz's nephew. Yes, the same Frederick Franz who had promoted 1975. He'd been part of the organization his entire life. Born in 1922, he was a third-generation witness. He'd pioneered. He'd served at Bethel headquarters. He'd done missionary work in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. In 1965, he was appointed to work on Aid to Bible Understanding, a major biblical encyclopedia the organization was producing. He spent years researching and writing for that project. Then, in 1971, he was appointed to the governing body itself, the small group of men at the very top who directed the entire worldwide organization. Raymond Franz was as inside as you could possibly get. But the 1975 failure started cracking his confidence. He'd seen how the expectation had been built. He'd been in the meetings. He'd watched his uncle stoke the anticipation. And then he'd watched the organization shift blame onto the members who had simply believed what they were told. His research for the aid book had already raised questions in his mind. He dug deep into the organization's teachings about chronology, about 607 BCE as the date of Jerusalem's destruction, about the whole framework that supported the 1914 doctrine. The evidence wasn't there. Secular historians unanimously dated Jerusalem's fall to 586 or 587 BCE, not 607. The whole chronological system the organization had built was based on a date that couldn't be supported. After 1975, Raymond started looking more carefully at how the governing body actually operated. What he saw troubled him. Decisions weren't being guided by careful Bible study or divine revelation. They were being made through votes, through power dynamics, through institutional inertia. Doctrines were changed or preserved based on internal politics, not scriptural insight. He saw how the organization handled members who questioned. He saw the fear, the control, the punishment, and he couldn't reconcile any of it with the Christianity he read about in the New Testament. In 1980, the crisis came to a head. Raymond Franz was removed from the governing body. A few months later, he was disfellowshipped entirely. The official reason was almost absurdly trivial. He'd shared a meal with his employer, Peter Gregerson, who happened to be a disassociated witness. One meal, one lunch with the man he worked with every day. That was enough to expel a man who had served at the highest levels of the organization for decades. But everyone knew the real reason. Raymond had doubted. He had questioned. He had seen behind the curtain, and what he saw there made it impossible for him to keep pretending. After his expulsion, Raymond spent years writing about what he'd experienced. His book, Crisis of Conscience, published in 1983, became one of the most important documents in the ex-witness community. In it, he described the inner workings of the governing body, the political maneuvering, the doctrinal inconsistencies, the gap between what the organization claimed to be and what it actually was. The book wasn't angry or bitter. It was sad, thoughtful, the work of a man who had genuinely believed and had lost that belief through careful, honest examination. The organization responded the only way it knew how. They declared the book apostate literature. They forbade witnesses from reading it. They treated Raymond Franz as a dangerous enemy who had betrayed Jehovah himself. But the book survived. It circulated. It found its way to doubting witnesses around the world, and it helped countless thousands of people understand that their own doubts were valid, that the questions they'd been afraid to ask had answers, and that those answers revealed an organization very different from what it claimed to be. Raymond Franz was a governing body member. He dedicated his life to that organization. He knew it from the inside better than almost anyone. And when he looked carefully at what he'd given his life to, he couldn't keep believing. That's not apostasy. That's integrity. Here's what's important to see clearly. The policies that hurt members and former members, the blood doctrine, the shunning, the cycle of failed prophecies and blame shifting, none of this was ancient. None of it was original Christianity. None of it was even there at the beginning of this organization. Blood prohibition, 1945. Formal disfellowshipping, 1952. The 1975 disaster, manufactured in the 1960s by men who were now dead. These weren't divine revelations. They were administrative decisions made by specific people in specific decades. No one was trapped by God's law. They were trapped by policies invented in the 20th century by men who have never been held accountable for the damage they caused. Every drop of blood that was refused, every family that was torn apart, every future that was sacrificed for a date that never came. All of it traces back to decisions made in boardrooms and printed in magazines by men, fallible men. Men who got things wrong again and again and never truly owned it. Recognizing this pattern isn't rebellion, it's critical thinking. Walking away from policies invented within living memory isn't faithlessness. It's rational response to documented history. Anyone who finally learns this history isn't an enemy of truth. There's someone who found it. And that knowledge is freedom. So that's how the machine locked in. Blood, shunning, 1975, the policies that made the trap inescapable. Russell built a weird foundation. Rutherford turned it into an obedience system. Knorr and Franz filled that system with rules that reached into every corner of members' lives, their medical decisions, their family relationships, their hopes for the future. By the time the 1980s arrived, the cult was complete. The mechanisms were all in place. The control was total. But the story doesn't end there. Because the organization kept evolving, kept adapting, kept tightening its grip. The governing body era, the broadcasting, the child abuse scandals, the modern tightening. That's the final chapter. That's where this history meets the present. You've seen the kooky origins. You've seen the hostile takeover. You've seen the machine lock in. Now we need to see what it became, what it still is today, and why understanding this history matters, whether you lived it or you're learning about it for the first time. Because the organization didn't stop evolving after 1975. It kept adapting, kept tightening, kept finding new ways to maintain control in a changing world. This is the modern era, and this is where we connect the history to what it means. If you lived inside it, if you were affected by someone inside it, or if you're watching to understand how high control systems actually work. If you're just joining us, here's what you need to know. This organization started as a strange Bible study group built on pyramid prophecies and failed dates. It was taken over by a man who purged the dissenters and demanded absolute loyalty. Then it was filled with policies, blood, shunning, more failed prophecies that made the trap inescapable. By the 1980s, the cult was fully formed, but it wasn't finished evolving. The men running it today inherited that machinery, and they've been running it ever since. If you've lived inside this, parts of Act 4 may feel personal. If you didn't, this is where the history becomes a live case study, how a modern high-control organization operates right now, how it protects itself, and how ordinary people get trapped inside systems that punish questions. This is where history meets the present. Let's talk about who actually runs this organization today. The Watchtower is controlled by a small group of men called the governing body. Currently, there are 11 of them as of late 2024, though the number has varied over the years, ranging from as few as 7 to as many as 18 at different points. They're all men. They're all older. Most have spent their entire adult lives in the organization's hierarchy, and they claim to be the sole channel of communication between God and humanity. That's not an exaggeration. That's not me being dramatic. That's what they teach, explicitly, in their publications and broadcasts. The governing body teaches that they are the faithful and discreet slave mentioned in the Bible, the sole channel through which Jehovah God provides spiritual instruction to humanity. They claim that God guides their decisions through Holy Spirit. They claim that obeying them is functionally the same as obeying God Himself. If you question them, you're questioning God. If you disobey them, you're disobeying God. If you think they're wrong about something, you're setting yourself up in opposition to divine authority. That's an extraordinary claim, and like all extraordinary claims, it deserves extraordinary evidence. But when you ask for that evidence, when you ask how we know these particular men are divinely appointed, the answer is essentially circular. They're God's channel because they say they're God's channel, and if you doubt that, it just proves you lack faith. But here's what's interesting about the governing body. It didn't always exist in its current form. Under Russell, there was no governing body. Russell was a central figure, but the Bible students were loosely organized. Under Rutherford, the organization was essentially a one-man dictatorship. Rutherford made the decisions. The term governing body appeared occasionally in Watchtower literature during this era, but it didn't refer to a distinct ruling council with supreme authority. The transformation happened gradually after Rutherford's death. Nathan Knorr and Frederick Franz shared power informally, but the formal restructuring came in 1971. In that year, the organization officially created an expanded governing body with real decision-making power. The president was no longer the sole authority. Instead, a group of men would collectively oversee the organization's spiritual direction. By 1976, the restructuring was complete. The governing body had become the supreme authority over all doctrinal and organizational matters. The president's role became more administrative. Real power rested with the body as a collective. This might sound like a move toward democracy or accountability. It wasn't. What it actually accomplished was the diffusion of responsibility. When one man makes all the decisions, you can point to that man and hold him accountable for failures. When a committee makes decisions through voting, everyone can hide behind the group. No single person is responsible. The institution itself becomes the authority, abstract, faceless, unaccountable. The governing body answers to no one. There's no mechanism for ordinary witnesses to vote them out. There's no external oversight or accountability. They can't be questioned, because in their framework, questioning leadership is treated as apostasy, a word they use to mean a dangerous enemy, not simply a person who disagrees. They can't be criticized, because criticizing them is defined as rebellion against God. They've created the perfect closed loop. They claim divine authority, and the only evidence for that authority is their own claim. Anyone who questions the claim is defined as spiritually corrupt. The system is designed to be impervious to challenge. Think about what that means for someone who grows up in this system. They're taught from childhood that these men speak for God. Disobeying them is disobeying Jehovah. Questioning them is the same as questioning divine authority. How does anyone in that position even begin to evaluate whether the leaders are right about anything? The system is designed to make critical thinking feel like sin. For most of the organization's history, the governing body stayed in the background. Most members couldn't name them. They couldn't pick them out of a lineup. These men were anonymous bureaucrats running things from behind the scenes at headquarters. The focus was always supposed to be on Jehovah, not on human leaders. That changed dramatically in 2014. In that year, the organization launched JW Broadcasting, a monthly video program featuring governing body members speaking directly to the membership. Suddenly, these anonymous committee members had faces. They had voices. They had personalities. They were on screen every month, teaching, exhorting, joking, and, increasingly, asking for money.
Jehovah's physical gifts, such as the rain, sunshine, and oxygen, are recurring. What's one way to imitate this aspect of Jehovah's giving? Many have chosen to set something aside each month by scheduling recurring online donations.
The shift was jarring for longtime members. The organization had always emphasized that it didn't have a clergy class, no priests, no pastors, no celebrity leaders to follow. Members were supposed to follow Jehovah and the Bible, not men. The focus on human leadership was supposed to be a characteristic of false religion. But JW Broadcasting put men front and center. Governing body members became celebrities within the organization. Their talks were analyzed, quoted, and discussed. Their personalities became well known. Some of what appeared on JW Broadcasting was strange, very strange. There were appeals for money that felt more like televangelism than anything witnesses had seen before. Slick, professional, emotionally manipulative. There were animations for children that critics found deeply disturbing. Cartoons warning kids about demons, about the horrors that awaited them if they left the organization. There was a video where a governing body member, Anthony Morris III, spent significant time discussing tight pants on men. He warned that they were inappropriate, possibly homosexual, and that the governing body wouldn't approve of them.
Is for these young fellas, because the older ones aren't doing much of it, thankfully. It's the metrosexual look. We've addressed that in the past. We've said things about it. But what's happened now, it's really caught on more. Now, metrosexual, that's the tight suit jacket and the tight pants, better known as tight pants.
These weren't fringe opinions shared in casual conversation. These were broadcast to millions of people as spiritual guidance from God's appointed representatives on earth. For many members, JW Broadcasting became an unexpected window into how the leadership actually thought. And for some, what they saw raised questions they'd never considered before. The men on screen didn't seem divinely guided. They seemed like ordinary men, sometimes petty, sometimes odd, sometimes more concerned with trivialities than with anything that actually mattered. The mask was slipping, and once you saw it slip, you couldn't unsee it. Many members who watched JW Broadcasting felt that something was off. The tone seemed different from traditional teachings. The focus on money felt uncomfortable. The strange fixations on clothing seemed trivial. They weren't imagining things. Something had shifted. The mask was slipping, and a lot of people noticed. Now we need to talk about something that's been remarkably difficult to surface publicly: the systematic mishandling of child sexual abuse. Why has this information been so hard to access? If you've been wondering what this kind of closed-loop authority structure produces when it's protecting itself at all costs, this is the result. This isn't gossip. This isn't speculation. This is documented fact established through legal proceedings, government investigations, and the organization's own internal documents. In 2015 and 2016, the Australian Royal Commission, a government body with legal authority to compel testimony and subpoena documents, examined how Jehovah's Witnesses handled allegations of child abuse within their organization. What they found was devastating. The commission discovered that the organization had records of over 1,006 alleged perpetrators of child sexual abuse in Australia alone. Over 1,000 accused abusers in one country. And how many of those cases had the organization reported to police? 0. Not one. Not a single case. Let that sink in. The organization knew about over 1,000 people accused of sexually abusing children within their congregations. They had files, they had names, they had documentation, and they reported none of it to the authorities whose job it is to protect children and prosecute criminals. The commission found that the organization's internal policies actively discouraged reporting abuse to authorities. Elders were trained to handle accusations internally through the judicial committee process. Everything was supposed to stay in-house. What does that prioritize? The safety of children or the reputation of the institution? Victims were often required to confront their abusers directly, a traumatizing experience that most abuse survivors are never subjected to in any legitimate justice system. And then there was the two-witness rule. The two-witness rule is based on a verse in the Bible about establishing wrongdoing through multiple witnesses. The organization applied this rule to abuse accusations. Unless there were 2 witnesses to the abuse, which there almost never are because abusers don't assault children in front of audiences, the elders often couldn't take formal action. Think about what that means in practice. A child tells her parents she was abused. The parents tell the elders. The elders call the accused person in and ask if he did it. He denies it. Now what? There's one witness, the victim, and one denial. In the organization system, that's a stalemate. The accusation can't be established. The abuser stays in the congregation. The child has to sit in the same kingdom hall and attend the same meetings with the person who violated her. The accused might even be assigned privileges, because as far as the official record is concerned, nothing happened. The child's testimony alone wasn't enough. The Commission's findings weren't based on speculation or anti-witness bias. They were based on the organization's own internal documents. The Watchtower had maintained a database of accused abusers. They knew who these people were. They had compiled the information themselves, and they had systematically failed to protect children or notify the authorities who could. Senior representatives of the organization testified before the Commission under oath. Their testimony was described as evasive, defensive, and at times openly contradictory. When asked directly whether their policies had failed to protect children, they deflected. When asked if they would change those policies, they refused to commit. When confronted with the obvious inadequacy of the two-witness rule in abuse cases, they defended it as biblical. If this section is hard-hitting, that's understandable. We're talking about children being hurt and an institution protecting itself instead of protecting them. Take a breath if you need to. This is heavy material. But it's important, because this is what the organization was doing while claiming to be God's sole channel on earth. This is what was happening behind the scenes while they told you that worldly organizations were corrupt and only they could be trusted. Australia wasn't an isolated case. Similar allegations and legal battles have emerged elsewhere, including significant court cases and settlements in the United States. Lawsuits have revealed internal documents showing the organization knew about abusers and failed to act. Some cases have resulted in multi-million-dollar judgments against the Watchtower. Investigative journalists in multiple countries have documented the pattern. The organization's response has been consistent: deny, deflect, and fight. They've spent millions of dollars on legal fees fighting abuse victims in court. They've resisted discovery requests for their internal databases of accused abusers. They've instructed elders to contact the legal department before contacting police. In some cases, they've paid settlements, but only with confidentiality agreements that prevent victims from speaking publicly about what happened. This isn't a few bad actors. This is institutional policy. The organization created systems that protected abusers and silenced victims, and they fought tooth and nail to prevent accountability. They told their members the world was dangerous. They told them worldly organizations were corrupt. They told them that only inside the organization were you truly safe. Meanwhile, they were maintaining a database of accused child abusers and reporting none of them to police. The call was coming from inside the house. When institutional protection consistently takes priority over individual protection, what does that tell us about what the system values? The institution's survival was always the priority, not truth, not justice, not the safety of children, the institution. In recent years, the organization has been going through significant changes. Some observers see these as signs of an institution under stress, maybe even in decline. Congregations have been merged and kingdom halls sold, sometimes over the objections of local members who had built and paid for those buildings themselves. In some cases, congregations that had existed for decades were dissolved overnight. The property was sold. The proceeds went to headquarters, not to the local congregation who had sacrificed to build them. This represents a significant shift. For generations, witnesses were told that building kingdom halls was a sacred privilege, a way of serving Jehovah, of providing a place for worship, of investing in their local spiritual community. People gave thousands of dollars. They volunteered thousands of hours. They built those buildings with their own hands, literally. And then headquarters took them and sold them, without meaningful consultation, without compensation. The message was clear. You don't actually own anything. Everything belongs to the organization. Bethel, the headquarters staff, has been dramatically downsized. Long-serving members have been sent home, sometimes after decades of full-time service. People who gave their entire working lives to the organization who never held outside jobs, never built retirement savings, never developed marketable skills, found themselves in their 50s or 60s with nothing. No pension, no savings, no work history that employers would recognize, no safety net, just a pat on the back and good luck in the world they've been taught to fear. The organization has pushed members to donate more frequently. They've introduced electronic donation methods at Kingdom Halls, making it easier than ever to give automatically. They've produced videos that critics say pressure even children to donate. They've heavily emphasized legacy giving, encouraging members to leave their estates to the Watchtower when they die. For an organization that spent decades criticizing the televangelists and megachurch pastors for their focus on money, the irony is striking. Meanwhile, doctrinal changes have come fast and are sometimes contradictory. The generation teaching, central to the organization's claim that the end is imminent, has been revised multiple times. Each revision pushed the timeline further out, creating new theological gymnastics to explain while the members are still waiting for Armageddon. Rules about beards have shifted, forbidden, then permitted, with no acknowledgement of how many people were judged and marginalized for facial hair that's now apparently fine. Rules about dress, about association, about what's acceptable entertainment have shifted back and forth. For longtime members, it can feel disorienting. The organization they grew up in doesn't exist anymore. The certainty they were promised keeps eroding. The rules keep changing, and every change is presented as new light, as if it's evidence of divine guidance rather than evidence that the old position was wrong. Inside the organization, change is always presented as new light, evidence of divine guidance, progressive revelation. But from the outside, it looks different. It looks like an organization making it up as they go, adjusting teachings when they become untenable and hoping no one notices the pattern. So why does any of this matter? Why spend 2 hours tracing the history of this organization? Because understanding where it came from helps everyone understand what it actually is. Members are told this is God's organization, the truth, the only path to salvation. They're told it has always taught the truth, that any changes are just refinements as the light gets brighter. But now we've seen the reality. We've seen that it started with a man who thought pyramids could predict the future. We've seen that the control mechanisms were engineered by a power-hungry lawyer in the 1920s and 30s. We've seen that the policies that cause harm, blood, shunning, the cycle of failed prophecies, were invented by specific people in specific decades. None of it was ancient. None of it was divine. None of it was inevitable. It was all built by men. Fallible, flawed, sometimes dishonest men. Men who got things wrong repeatedly and never truly owned their failures. Men who built a system that protected itself at the expense of the people inside it. And that means something important. If it was built by men, it can be evaluated by anyone. No one has to accept it on faith. No one has to suppress their doubts. No one has to feel guilty for seeing what they see. Critical thinking isn't rebellion, it's just thinking. In the last decade, something changed. Information stopped being containable. Archives became searchable. Court records became public. Former members began comparing notes across countries. And once people can compare what they were told with what actually happened, the system's control gets harder to maintain. Every year, more members start noticing the pattern. The internet has made information accessible in ways that weren't possible a generation ago. Former members share their stories. Researchers document the history. The organization's own publications, archived and searchable, contradict what's being taught today. The isolation isn't working like it used to. People are finding their way out. And here's what they're discovering on the other side. Life goes on. It's hard at first, especially for those who lose family to shunning. But it goes on. People rebuild. People heal. People find new communities, new purposes, new ways of understanding the world. The organization tells members that leaving means destruction, that they'll be lost without it, that the world outside is empty and dangerous. But the evidence says otherwise. For those just starting to notice the pattern, uncertain, maybe scared about what comes next, that's a normal part of the process. No one has to figure it all out immediately. No decisions need to be made right now. The important thing is to keep thinking, keep questioning, keep trusting the mind that noticed something was wrong. The clarity comes with time. So let's bring this full circle. For the millions of people who have lived inside this organization, and for anyone trying to understand what that experience is like, this is what it looks like from the inside. Even if you've never been a witness, you've seen versions of this pattern: public loyalty rituals, surveillance by community, and the fear of being socially erased. Picture sitting in those kingdom halls, year after year, meeting after meeting, as a child swinging your legs because they don't reach the floor, as a teenager feeling guilty for thoughts you can't control, as an adult trying to make yourself believe, trying to silence the voice that keeps saying something isn't right. Picture knocking on doors until your feet hurt, standing on street corners holding magazines, giving up Saturday mornings, summer vacations, holiday celebrations, missing birthday parties and Christmas dinners and normal childhood experiences because you've been told those things are dangerous, pagan, displeasing to God. This is what millions of people gave. Their Saturdays, their holidays, their time, their money, their trust, their very sense of self to an organization that told them it spoke for God. They did everything right, followed the rules, studied the publications, prepared for meetings, commented from the audience to show they were paying attention, went out in service even when they didn't want to, reported their hours, tried to increase their hours. They suppressed the doubts. Every time a question arose, they pushed it down, told themselves they were being prideful or weak or tempted by Satan, did what they were told, wait on Jehovah, pray more, study more. The doubts are the problem, not the things causing them. Swap the vocabulary in the building, but the psychology is the same anywhere: fear, conformity, and the threat of social erasure. They tried so hard to believe because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Everyone they loved was inside. Their whole identity was inside. Their hope of surviving Armageddon was inside. The cost of questioning was everything. And then, at some point, they couldn't do it anymore. Something broke through. The doubts wouldn't stay buried. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. They saw something, or read something, or experienced something that made the whole structure start to crack. And once the crack was there, it spread. It always spreads. Maybe someone used that word, apostasy, as if questioning were the same as betrayal. Maybe family members stopped speaking to them. Maybe elders said they'd been corrupted by Satan or seduced by worldly thinking. Maybe they were told they were proud, that their problem was refusing to submit to God's organization. But look at what they were actually inside. A movement started by a man who believed the Great Pyramid of Giza could predict the future. A man who sold miracle wheat at 60 times the market price. A man whose own wife left him and whose court records describe egotism and domination. Taken over by a lawyer who staged a corporate coup, purged everyone who wouldn't submit, and built himself a mansion for prophets who never came while his followers struggled through the Depression. Institutionalized by men who invented the blood doctrine in 1945 and watched people die for it, who created the shunning policy in 1952 to make leaving feel impossible, who stoked expectations about 1975 and then blamed the members when it failed. Run today by men who oversaw a system that kept over 1,000 accused abusers out of police databases, who fought victims in court. What does that pattern suggest about institutional priorities? That's what members were asked to trust with their eternal salvation. That's what they were told was their only hope of surviving the end of the world. They didn't betray God. They didn't abandon truth. They didn't betray their conscience. They left a system built by flawed men over 140 years, a system that got it wrong, spectacularly, repeatedly, harmfully wrong, and blamed them when they noticed. Anyone who's been through this is allowed to trust their own mind now. That mind, the one that noticed the contradictions, that felt the dissonance, that finally said, something isn't right here, was working exactly as it should. It was working better than the organization wanted. That's why they warned against it. That's why they said not to trust it. But the questioning mind wasn't the problem. It was the solution. People leaving a high control system are allowed to do the ordinary human things they were trained to fear: celebrate, belong, explore, change their mind. Former members are allowed to build friendships outside the approved circle, allowed to revise their beliefs without asking permission, allowed to make mistakes without fearing eternal destruction, allowed to be human, finally, fully, without the constant weight of judgment and fear. No one who left was ever an apostate. No one was ever spiritually weak. They were people who needed the truth to be true. And when they found out it wasn't, they had the courage to face that, even when it cost them, even when it hurt. That's not betrayal. That's integrity. And that integrity, that willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even into uncomfortable places, is the most trustworthy quality a person can have. It always was. The organization told members they couldn't trust themselves, that their hearts were desperately wicked, that their minds were unreliable, that they needed the organization to tell them what was true, what to believe, how to live. The organization was wrong. People can trust themselves. They always could. The organization just couldn't afford for them to know that. Because the moment someone trusts their own mind, they stop needing the organization. So what happens when someone starts questioning or decides they can't stay? That answer looks different for everyone. Some people dive into research, learning everything they can about the history and doctrines they were never allowed to examine. Some focus on rebuilding relationships, reconnecting with family members outside the organization, making new friends, building a new community. Some need time to grieve, to process, just to breathe. Some set quiet boundaries while they figure out what's safe. The point isn't a single right way out. The point is reclaiming the right to think without fear. The road out isn't easy. Being shunned is a real loss, and it hurts. Watching family members stay in is painful too. There are hard days, but there are also good days. Days when the low-grade anxiety hasn't shown up in weeks. Days when something that was once feared becomes enjoyable. Days when thinking freely doesn't feel scary anymore. Those days come, and they come more often as time passes. No one has to do this alone. Thousands of people have walked this road before. There are communities, online and in person, of former members, affected families, and survivors of high control groups who understand exactly what the experience is like. People who get it because they lived it. Now you can see the whole machine at once. How it started. One man, some pyramids, a lot of failed dates. How it turned. Rutherford's hostile takeover, the purges, the centralization of power, how it locked in, blood, shunning, 1975, the machinery of control, and what it is today, an organization that claims divine authority while hiding abuse and silencing dissent. From kooky to cult, 140 years of history built by men, now documented for anyone to evaluate. Once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. And that's the point. Systems like this don't survive exposure. What anyone does with this information is their choice. But whatever they choose, they can choose it freely. Choose it because it makes sense, not because someone said it was the only option. Everyone's life belongs to them, not to an organization, not to a governing body, not to men who thought pyramids predicted the future or that tight pants were a spiritual threat. To them. Make it count. This documentary traced one organization's path from kooky to cult, but the patterns we've seen, the failed prophecies reframed as spiritual tests, the isolation mechanisms, the loyalty demands that override family bonds, the institutional protection of abusers, these patterns aren't unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. They show up in high control groups around the world. Different names, different doctrines, same machinery. Understanding how one system works makes it easier to recognize the pattern everywhere it appears. If this documentary gave you clarity, share it with someone who's inside a system that punishes questions, someone who's been taught that their discomfort means they are the problem. Sometimes discomfort is just the mind doing its job, noticing a pattern that doesn't add up. They deserve to know they're not alone. I wanted to pause for a second to ask for your support by becoming a channel member of the channel by clicking the join button below. It starts at a whopping $4 a month. If that won't break the bank for you, it helps me be able to produce more content like this. If it would break the bank for you, by all means, just keep watching. Thank you in advance for your generous support.